All right. Good morning, all. My name is Harry Ma. I'm an investment manager here at Sharewise. And welcome to another Sharewise webinar. Today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Percheron Therapeutics Managing Director and CEO, Dr. James Garner. Good morning to you, James.
Good morning, Harry. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
No dramas at all. As usual, to all our attendees, this webinar is recorded. So if you can't view the whole live viewing, you'll have the ability to do so on our YouTube channel, which will be uploaded shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. And by all means, we invite all attendees to submit Q&A questions. We'll have time at the end for questions. But without further ado, James, over to you with your presentation.
Thanks, Harry, and good morning again to everybody who's joined us today. It's a real pleasure to introduce our company, Percheron Therapeutics. I'm going to give a brief 10-minute overview of what we're doing, and then, as Harry touched on, be really happy to field some questions. So let me move straight into a few slides here. And by the way, this is our non-confidential corporate deck. You can download this from our website. We won't go through everything here today in the interest of time, but there's a lot of detail on our website that expands on the things we're going to talk about here. But I want to jump straight in and talk a little bit about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, because that's the primary focus of our company at the moment. And this is one of those diseases that really sort of brings home the need for new research in this kind of space. This is a genetic disease of children. It's primarily, well, it's almost exclusively a disease of boys. And it primarily affects children between the age of about 4 or 5 at the time of diagnosis. And what happens is these children begin to show progressive muscle weakness. By the time they reach their teens, they are typically wheelchair bound. And then life expectancy, sad to say, is in the mid-20s. What causes this disease? Well, boys with Duchenne have a genetic abnormality in a protein called dystrophin, which is a structural protein in muscle. And ordinarily, dystrophin protects muscles from mechanical damage when boys are moving their limbs. In the absence of dystrophin, every time a boy moves their limbs, it's causing mechanical damage to the tissue of the muscle. That causes chronic inflammation, and gradually the muscle degrades over time. And that's associated with progressive weakness. So this is a devastating disease by any reckoning, and sad to say, it's not an uncommon disease. Duchenne affects somewhere between about 1 in 6,000, 1 in 7,000 live male births. So as these genetic diseases go, as these rare genetic diseases go, it is sadly all too common. We do have some medicines to treat this, but to cut a long story short, they don't work fantastically well. On the top half of this slide, we've got a group of drugs which try to replace the missing protein, dystrophin. And in theory, that makes an enormous amount of sense. It just stands to reason that if the problem is a lack of dystrophin, the solution would be to try and replace it. Unfortunately, all these drugs produce pretty small quantities of dystrophin, and in many cases, the dystrophin they make is not as good as the real thing. So what we see is that these drugs in the top half of the slide tend to just not work very well. And many of them are only applicable to small subgroups of patients. Most of them are not really useful for the whole group of Duchenne patients. So that leaves us on the bottom half of the slide with drugs which aim to combat the inflammation that results from a lack of dystrophin. And we have many diseases that are driven primarily by inflammation, hepatitis, many types of chronic kidney disease, asthma. Duchenne is in many respects an inflammatory disease as well. And so we treat it with anti-inflammatory drugs, including drugs like steroids, and more recently with a couple of other newer drugs, many of which are broadly steroids in mechanism. Now, this is where our work at Percheron fits in. Our drug, avicursen, also known as ATL1102, is an anti-inflammatory drug. It aims to treat the inflammation that results from Duchenne, but it's not a steroid. And that's crucial because steroids are very toxic drugs, and to use them for long periods of time in young children is really very, very far from ideal. So our drug has, on the face of it, on present evidence, a much better safety profile, none of the toxicities of steroids, possibly better efficacy, and is applicable in in principle to the whole range of Duchenne patients, not just small pockets and subgroups, but to the broader pool of Duchenne patients. So we think this has the potential to be a very, very promising treatment for Duchenne, possibly a backbone treatment for combination with others. And that's why we're developing it. Now, I'll just jump ahead and show you a little bit of clinical data here. There's a lot of information here, so I'm just going to pick out one data point from this slide, which is in this main table in the middle of the slide, the PUL2 score, PUL2. Stands for performance of the upper limb, and this is a measure of how well a boy can really use their arm, including wrist, elbow, and shoulder. And in practical terms, it translates into things like, can the boy drink a cup of water? Can he brush his teeth? Can he operate a joystick on a wheelchair? Can he prop himself up on an armrest? Those sorts of things are captured in the PUL2 score. And we look at the upper limb here specifically because we've done this study in boys who have already reached the point in the disease where they're wheelchair bound. I mentioned earlier that around the age of about 12 or 13, boys with Duchenne typically lose the ability to walk. That has the effect of dividing the population into an earlier stage group who are still ambulant, still walking, and a later stage group, a non-ambulant group, who've lost the ability to walk. We've been doing our trials in the non-ambulant group. We think that's where the need is greatest. And so we look at the upper limb, we look at arm function as a measure of how well our drug's working. And as you can see in this table, for 9 boys treated with AT1102, avicursen, our drug, after 6 months, we saw an improvement in the PUL2 score of 0.9 points. And obviously that begs the question, well, what happens without the drug? Is that an improvement? Well, we had to answer that drug by looking at a group of patients outside the study. Every patient in our study had the drug, so we have to compare with patients outside the study. And specifically, we compared against a group of boys from a historical cohort in Rome, Italy, where we had really good data. And over the same period of time, a matched cohort, in other words, kids who exactly resemble the patients in our trial, over 6 months, they saw a 2-point decline in the PUL2 score. So by implication, the difference here is about 2.9 points. Now, to be clear, that's a really good result. If we were to see that replicated in a larger randomized controlled trial, we think that that would be a knockout result. So this is a really promising early stage study. It's an exploratory study. It's a relatively small study, but it gave us really, really encouraging data to support the further development of this drug in Duchenne. There are 2 caveats for this study. One is it's small, just 9 boys. That's not actually all that tiny for these rare diseases, but it's still not quite enough for us to hang our hat on. And secondly, it's a single arm study. So every boy in the trial had the treatment. And we really like to do what we call randomized controlled trials, trials with a placebo group, so we can be absolutely sure how much is due to our drug and how much is due to other factors. So we started exactly that study in June of last year. We started a phase 2b clinical trial running in 5 countries, Australia and 4 European countries. And this is a much larger study, 48 patients recruited to this study in the end, so significantly bigger than the previous phase 2a study. And this is a randomized controlled trial with a placebo group, and in fact, with 2 doses of avicursen. But in other respects, we've taken the view, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've really tried to reflect the same patients as in the previous trial. Now, this study is going to see its first data readout in December of this year. We'll see data from the first 6 months of treatment of all the boys in the study, all 48 boys, first 6 months. We'll be reporting that data in December. So this is coming up on us fast. We're at a point in our company's evolution, we're about to see this really, really important data readout within a matter of weeks, really. So we're tremendously excited about this, and obviously it's a great time to be sharing the story with the broader investment community. I'll just say one more thing, and then maybe we can turn to some questions. But obviously the question that all this invites is, where does this drug go off the basis of this study? What happens next? Well, the data we see in December will just be the first of several data readouts. We will see 12-month data in mid-2025, and then in fact, we'll see a 16-month data readout in the latter part of 2025. So one of the beauties of this study is that it does give us multiple shots on goal, multiple bites of the cherry. It gives us several points to win. We're obviously very focused on this 6-month readout in December at the moment because that's very imminent, but we will get more information about the drug as we go. As this pool of data comes through, there's a few ways this could take us. Now, if the drug is really looking great, if we're seeing something like the kind of treatment effect suggested by the previous study, we think it's worth having a conversation with regulatory agencies like FDA to see if this could be a basis for getting approval for the drug. FDA has a mechanism to do this. They call it accelerated approval. And we think that positive data could make that a worthwhile discussion to have. So we're certainly keeping that option open. If the data is positive, but not quite meeting that hurdle, then we may have to do some further clinical work, but we'd be doing that with the confidence that comes from a successful study. And certainly our hope as a company would be that we would do that work in conjunction with a larger pharmaceutical company as a partner. And then, of course, for completeness, we're all investors in biotech. We understand that we can get unexpected results in clinical trials. And one of the beauties of avicursen is because of the way the drug works, because it has this broad anti-inflammatory action, it does have potential applicability in other diseases. And we have got some data, both human data and animal data, that shows it to be potentially efficacious in a number of other illnesses. So this is not an all or nothing bet on Duchenne. It's our primary focus at the moment, but we do have other ways to take this drug forward. And we've started to explore a few of those in the background. So whatever we see in December, I think it's going to be an incredibly exciting moment for the company. It's going to push us onto one of these three paths in broad terms. And we think whichever way we go, there's some real opportunities to win here. And most importantly, an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of patients. So really happy to share the story here. And Harry, maybe a good moment to turn to some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. That was a great presentation. And already got 2 Q&A questions that have been submitted. I've also got questions of my own. I guess just to start a bit more holistically, for those new to the company, can you provide a bit of a brief overview on Percheron Therapeutics, the story, and also the current sort of focuses of the business?
Yes, Harry, absolutely. Percheron's actually one of the most well-established biotech companies on the ASX. We were previously known as Antisense Therapeutics. The company was founded around about the turn of the century. And many investors will have come across it in that guise. And at the beginning of the year, we changed our name from Antisense to Percheron. This has reflected a few things. The first is that we have largely a different team on board now. I joined the company just last year. And in fact, the median age of the team within Percheron is probably somewhere around 9 months at the moment. So we are largely a new team that has come on board in the company. And with that has come, I think, a new strategic focus. I think this really very, very tight focus around Duchenne. We take the view that sometimes in the life of a biotech company, it behooves us to do one thing well rather than to spread ourselves too thin. So because of all those things, we've changed the name of the company, but also, as I say, changed the focus. And as we've touched on, Duchenne is very much what we live and breathe at the moment. But I think it is really important to reflect that we do have other opportunities in front of us, other irons in the fire. There are other use cases for our drug. There are other diseases where it could have really material benefit. And we've got a second drug in the pipeline, and we reserve the right to come back to those things at a time of our choosing. So I think at the moment we're a very focused company, but we have a lot of other things we can do, and any kind of success in this trial, I think, might start to open up those opportunities.
Yeah, perfect. And just on Duchenne, obviously you mentioned it's a genetic condition for young children, specifically in young boys. Can you sort of dive into a bit more as to what that diagnosis means for the families of those with the disease. And you spoke about a few of the drugs that are currently in market, at market. What does the current treatment landscape look like for those with Duchenne muscular dystrophy look like?
Yeah, Harry, absolutely. I think you touch on a really important point there when you say, what does this mean for families? Because a diagnosis like Duchenne is not just something that affects the patient with the diagnosis, it's something that affects a whole family. And I was talking to a mother of a boy with Duchenne a few months ago, and something she said really brought it home. One key thing is that when all of us sleep at night, we move around in bed. We roll over multiple times during the night. If you don't do that, you get bed sores, nerve compression, all sorts of things. At some point in the Duchenne story, most boys with Duchenne lose the ability to roll themselves over in bed. And at that point, they have to call a carer, usually a parent, to wake up, come and move them in bed, and then go back to bed themselves. That can happen 4, 5, 6 times a night. And if you imagine, a parent of a boy with Duchenne doing that 4, 5, 6 times a night, every night, that's just one example of how much a disease like this takes over the life of families. And what follows from that is that even relatively modest incremental benefits in the clinical course of the disease can make an enormous difference to families. Sadly, we don't have a curative therapy for this disease on the horizon anytime soon. But if we can make little incremental differences, that can translate into a huge improvement in people's lives. And unfortunately, little incremental differences probably characterizes the treatment landscape quite well. Of those drugs that I sort of touched on in the presentation there, most of those drugs have, in a technical sense, failed to show any clinical benefit. When we put them in tests like the PUL2 score or walking tests, things like that, they don't really measurably move the needle for kids. Parents still swear by them. Regulators still are inclined to try and make them available because we have so little to treat these patients. But this is a disease where our standard of care is still really poor. There's still a huge need for new drugs. And that's part of what we're trying to answer.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And on avicursen, more specifically, this question, you spoke about how there's many other drugs out there that tend to not work, or they only focus on a subgroup of the disease, or they focus on the inflammation. You mentioned avicursen. It's not a steroid. It's anti-inflammatory. It's deemed safer, and it also tries to, pinpoint all patients. What do you think, or how competitive is the product likely to be in an increasingly busy market?
Harry, look, we think there's a couple of dimensions to that. So first of all, there's how well a drug works, and we'll get a better sense of that in December. But there are very, very few drugs available for these non-ambulant boys. So although there's a number of drugs available for Duchenne, once you get to these 50% of patients who are already wheelchair bound, the field is very thin, and so it's less competitive than it looks. Efficacy is one dimension. Safety is another big consideration. And on present evidence, so far, it looks like our drug has a very, very favorable safety profile. Really, the only thing we see with any consistency are mild injection site reactions. The drug is a weekly subcutaneous injection, a bit like insulin or Ozempic or some of those kinds of drugs. So occasionally patients get a bit of redness around the injection site, but this is a very, very non-toxic drug on present evidence, which is not universally the case for other drugs here. And there's also a dimension of patient convenience wrapped up in this. So when we look at some of the existing drugs, some of these drugs are weekly intravenous infusions. You have to take your 5-year-old kid to a doctor's office. They have an IV put in. They have to sit there for an hour while the drug's infused. Our drug's not like that. It's an injection parents can give at home once a week. So all these things kind of play into the commercial positioning of the drug. And, it's we think this looks like being a very, very potentially a very promising addition to the treatment landscape. The final thing I'd say, though, is that in most diseases, and this is really true of diseases like Duchenne, it's not a fixed pie where each drug competes commercially for, for the biggest possible slice. As new drugs come into play, clinicians tend to mix and match them, and that will in turn expand the total pool here. So when we look at other drugs here, we don't see them necessarily as competitors in a strictly winner-takes-all kind of sense. We see them generally as tools in a toolkit that doctors can use to manage patients.
It's an interesting approach, definitely. And as you said, the field is pretty thin at the moment. I guess Duchenne is perceived as a bit of a rare disease. Do you think this rarity, say, as opposed to Alzheimer's, would that present more market opportunity? Do you think it's challenging? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, Harry, it's a great question. It's one, shareholders new to this sector often ask companies like ours. Because normally you hear somebody use the word rare and it sounds like a smaller opportunity. But of course, we've got to bear in mind that commercial opportunity for anything is a product of sort of how much you sell, the volume, and also price. Now, certainly there are fewer Duchenne patients than there are Alzheimer's patients, for example, or type 2 diabetes patients, or hypertension patients, thankfully. But pricing for drugs in these kind of diseases is usually very favorable. So if we look at many of the drugs that are already approved, they have sticker prices, if you like, of $600,000-$700,000 per year of treatment. That's US dollars. One of the therapies that's been recently approved in this disease is $3.2 million US dollars per shot. Now, you only take one dose, but it's a $3.2 million injection. And that sort of pricing is broadly reflective of the rare diseases space. And it's one of the reasons why many companies, even quite large ones, have really seen this as being a very, very favorable disease to move into. For a small company like ours, the other benefit is that this can be a faster and cheaper place to conduct clinical trials. So if we look at Alzheimer's, for instance, I've done a bit of work there. Most of the trials are 4 or 5 years in length. They typically need 2,000 or 3,000 patients. They cost about $400 or $500 million a piece. That can be out of reach for a company like Percheron. But in a disease like Duchenne, 40, 50 patients can give you an enormous amount of information for your drug. One of the first drugs here was approved by FDA on the basis of 12 patients of data. So it makes it a little bit more realistic, I suppose, for companies like ours to target these slightly smaller pockets.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just back on avicursen, more specifically, if the trial readout is positive, could you sort of give a bit of context or, a bit of a path forward as to what the commercialization process would look like on your end?
Yeah. Harry, look, I think what I would say there is we have no real ambition ourselves as Percheron to commercialize the drug. It can be done. Diseases like this can lend themselves to smaller companies taking a drug all the way. But I think we have some degree of modesty in our ambitions. I think we know our limits, and we think that what we can add to this drug best is in the development stage. But we would like to partner it with a larger company for commercialization. And of course, that's a well-trodden path for Australian biotechs. You look at companies like, say, Neuron with their partner with Acadia. This is in a way common practice. And I think that's our aspiration for the drug. We're reasonably agnostic about when that happens. I think our concern is really just two things. We want to put it in the hands of a company that can do justice to the drug. We think it's very promising, and we want a partner that shares that ambition with us. And second, we want to structure any partnership that we do in a way that is maximally beneficial to our shareholders. But beyond those constraints, we will be looking to partner this drug. And obviously, as I always say, there is no better lubricant to pharmaceutical partnering than data, and we'll have some of that in December. And I think that'll put us in a good position to move some of those discussions forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Now I'm going to move on to some questions from some of our registrants prior to the webinar, and I'll also get to the Q&A box as well live. Could Percheron be in a good position to access a priority review voucher from an NDA? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. It's a really good question. Just for background, for those that aren't familiar with the priority review voucher scheme, FDA has an incentive they operate to encourage companies to develop drugs in neglected illnesses, pediatric illnesses like Duchenne, also some tropical illnesses and things like that. And the way this works is that if you can get your drug approved in the illness, they give you a priority review voucher, which entitles you on a future drug to get FDA to review it in 6 months rather than the usual 12 to 14. Now, that might sound a bit roundabout, but the key thing is these vouchers are tradable. You can sell them to other companies. The going rate is about $100 million US a piece. And you can see why they're useful, because if you're a company that's bringing out the next Ozempic with, let's say an $8–10 billion market opportunity, if you can get your drug approved 6 months faster, that's worth real money. And so these priority review vouchers can give you that opportunity. Now, we have the enabling designation from FDA. They call it rare pediatric disease designation. We already have that. So if we can get the drug approved in Duchenne, we should get one of these priority review vouchers. We will sell it. And as I say, the going rate is about $100 million a piece. So it's a very nice near-term incentive for companies to launch products in these kinds of diseases.
Yeah, great. Sounds very encouraging. What would be, another question, what would be good or satisfactory scores on the PUL index from the PH2B trial that I believe is to be released in December?
Well, our phase 2A study, the study that we did a couple of years ago, the study with just 9 boys that I touched on in the early part of the session in the presentation, that suggested a treatment effect of 2.9 points on this PUL2 score, performance the upper limb score. Now, that would be an incredible result. If we replicate anything like that in this study, that would be amazing, because that would be very, very much better than any treatment has ever really shown in this population. Now, just to manage expectations, normally when drugs go into these larger multi-center studies, the gap narrows a little bit. That's just common for all kinds of reasons in drug development. So we'd be very, very satisfied with a figure somewhat lower than that. Difficult to put a sort of absolute figure. It's difficult to say there's a figure of X that represents a kind of black and white threshold for success, because it is genuinely a kind of a question of shades of gray, and it depends also what the other data looks like. If the PUL2 score looks okay, but everything else is very ho-hum, that's one scenario. But if the PUL2 score looks okay and everything else looks pretty good, that can be a very different scenario as well. When FDA looks at this, and other regulatory agencies, they very much look at what they call the balance of the evidence. They look at the totality of all the data and really try and put this together. So it's difficult in some ways to say, look, here's the threshold of success on one particular metric. The reality is this is going to be a question of what the total picture looks like, including the safety, including all the sort of secondary parameters. And at the end of the day, it won't be us that makes that judgment. It will be FDA and regulatory agencies like that. But I would just say the bar is probably not all that high.
Gotcha. Okay. And looking now at our Q&A questions, we've got one from Sam. The PER business and board appear to be 90% clinicians and scientists. Given the potential commercial stage, and you went into that and said, you don't think it's going to be fully commercialized, but will the company be expanding the expertise to include some people with commercial capability, or what do you think that looks like?
Yeah, Harry, thank you. Look, it is one of the distinguishing features of the company in many ways, is that we are a very sort of clinician-heavy company in a way. I'm a physician by background. The 2 non-executive directors in the company are both clinicians by background. We have a chief medical officer based in the United States. He's a very experienced clinician. And then we also have, I think, 3 colleagues who are PhD scientists. So we have a lot of that kind of intellectual and scientific horsepower in the company. And I think it is something that makes the company a little bit of an outlier in the Australian landscape. I think we would be not unusual in the US environment, where companies often have that kind of board management team, but maybe a little bit sort of science heavy here. I think that belies 2 things. The first is that despite the backgrounds of the team, I think we all have a great deal of experience in commercial businesses. Really, the focus of my career has been on drugs that are around launch, you know, sort of a couple of years before launch and a couple of years after launch. I've personally been involved in the launch of over 30 products into different markets, and about half a dozen very substantial licensing transactions. And my colleagues on the board, Dr. Charmaine Gittelson, was the former chief medical officer of CSL, obviously a very substantial commercial business, I think the world's 12th largest pharmaceutical company. And my colleague Gil Price, again, been a public company CEO in a number of both development and commercial stage businesses. And that's reflected in the management team, where there is similar experience. So I don't think the 2 things are contradictory. But as I say, really our focus as a company, what we want to be as an organization, is really to own the development of new drugs. We think that commercializing medicines and selling them day to day is probably a slightly different business. And we're very happy ultimately to leave that to a larger organization. That is part of our strategy for avicursen. So for now, I think in Percheron, we really want to master the development of new therapies. And as I say, we've been really focusing on doing that with avicursen in Duchenne.
Very good. Very good. Well, Dr. James Garner, thank you very much for attending today. I think that's all our questions. I'm very excited to see the future for Percheron and obviously avicursen. And yeah, hopefully we can do another webinar in the future and get an update.
All right. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Cheers.